here in just a second, but I'm going to hand it off to Bill Grismore, and we're going to get started. So Bill, take it away.
Everybody, welcome to this webinar. My name is William Grismore. I am one of the founders here at 27 Virtual and NSXT Architect. We're very happy to have everybody with us today. Also today, we have the CEO and founder of REST NSX doing a presentation as well. And we're just going to walk you through some of the different types of migrations you can do. I'm sure a lot of you are very interested in understanding this whole thing about migrating from NSX-V to NSXT and kind of what's involved. The one thing I can like to intro this with is that, at 27 Virtual, we take all different approaches. So we're going to talk about all the different methods and ways to do that. And we do encourage you, if you have any questions, throughout this webinar, there is no open mic, but you can definitely put questions in the chat. So
yes, we'll be monitoring the chat. So if you do ask a question, we'll get a pop-up and hopefully we'll be able to answer it in real time. Don't hesitate to ask any questions. We love that involvement with you guys in the audience, especially in these more virtual settings. It just gives a little bit more personality to these webinars. So feel free to hop in. Thanks again to DJ for joining us from REST NSX. And this is the NSXV to NSXT Migration Task Force webinar. It's a little term that we put together for our group that actually goes out and does these V to T migrations for 27 Virtual. So let's get started, Bill.
Right, so just a quick background on 27 Virtual. So from an NSX perspective, to keep this kind of short, we started with NSX back in 2014. We are a VMware trusted delivery partner that has a practice, if you will, around doing NSXV deployments, NSXT deployments, and now the migrations, from V to T. We've been working with VMware since the acquisition of Nicira back in 2014. We have a highly trained group of professionals that have lots of experience around, performing the deployments, getting involved in doing the actual migrations, because there's a lot of, details around, how to do the migration. Every customer's environment is definitely a little bit different. We have the certifications to support that and the experience and the lab environment to do all these kind of tests and validations as we go through this process. We've been doing vSphere, NSX, and vSAN, vRealize, you name it, from the beginning. We're kind of a VMware-centric shop, if you will. We also have a lot of different types of knowledge transfer sessions we do with our customers. If you engage with 27 Virtual, we do have another part of our business that is an education-focused part of our business. So we are definitely kind of unique in the fact that we have some really good knowledge around, training from an instructor standpoint. So we can not only do a deployment, which is also very important, but also being a part of actually helping you with the knowledge transfer process. This session today is being recorded. So you're going to get a link to this after this. Also, if you go to 27virtual.com/events, you can see this recording will be posted there in the next day or so. Also, a lot of our other recordings from other webinars are there as well. Again, I mentioned the microphones are muted. So if you have questions, just leverage the chat. And as Andrew said, do the survey at the end is really important to us. You get that chance to win that $100 Amazon gift card. And you can also reach us at info@27virtual.com.
Yeah, on our website, we have a whole bunch of other of these style presentations where we talk about the VMware approach to security. We talk about VMware Cloud Foundation and VxRail. We have other recordings around NSX, some things that we've done for vMug UserCon. So if you're just interested in general NSX knowledge beyond the V to T, but just digging into T a little bit, we have that on our website. So just go to 27virtual.com and find the events page, and they're all up there on YouTube. So why would we go to NSXT? What's this whole V to T migration for?
Yeah, so what is it? What is it all about, right? So if you look at the portfolio of products here, Andrew, we can see that, NSX has really grown over the years. I think most people here in this webinar today are pretty familiar with the product, but let's just kind of hit the, the highlights. We know that NSX is doing network security and virtualization. And if you kind of look at the bottom, you got the core product on the left side there, which is your NSX data center product. That's your core product that's going to be used on-prem. It's the same product that's used in the VMware Cloud on AWS. And within that product, you have NSX Intelligence, the new security around IDS, IPS, which is very exciting stuff. There's also this kind of other product, which is this NSX Cloud product that allows you to leverage native workloads in AWS or Azure, where we can actually install an agent and extend networks up into the cloud. If you look at the bottom there, you got the advanced load balancer as well as another feature. The service mesh, which is interesting for doing HCX migrations to actually help in moving workloads back and forth. So also one thing to note is that HCX, the Hybrid Connect tool, is something also that can be very useful, in migrations, going from NSXV to NSXT. But if you look at that left corner, the blue box you just saw that just popped up, one of the main things to realize is that NSXV was just that. And now NSXT does all of these things. The NSX intelligence around building these firewall rules for your application tiers and actually doing the discovery and giving you suggested rules right in the interface, which is a very powerful tool. And now the new intrusion detection and intrusion prevention type solution that adds on to the already very strong, microsegmentation. And then on the top, you got Network Insight and Log Insight, that do these things for us that help us as well, that kind of complement the NSX Intelligence product. So what does it do for us? So if we look at the benefits of NSXT, it's going to give us consistent networking security across workload types. So if you look at this graphic and kind of think about it, we're used to from the early 2006 through 2016 age or so, taking physical servers and virtualizing. So NSX is going to help with that traditional on-prem data center, virtualizing the network, giving us intrinsic security. But we can also now extend that now with the newer version of the product to container workloads and then to the cloud. There's even some support now for putting agents on bare metal workloads to allow us to extend security all the way out to like Windows 2016 and certain versions of Red Hat up. And then you get a centralized view of that inside the NSXT management console, which is very important. So the idea is to have networking and security that is going to be simple and scalable from on-prem and to the cloud, and have a single pane of glass, if you will, to manage all that. Plus, most of our customers we find are, 95% virtualized. So that's kind of where we're going.
Yeah, and we already got our first question in the Q&A, and it says chat is disabled. Yes, sorry everybody, chat is disabled. I think we might have mentioned chat, but we encourage you to use the Q&A panel in the Zoom window, and that's how you can get your questions answered. So we'll see those pop up. We get a notification, and we'll either type out an answer to you or answer it in person. And also, by the way, if we have some time at the end, what we'll do is we'll open up the mics for everybody, and we can get some actual discussion going if you want to hang out towards the end. So that's coming, but feel free and definitely do ask your questions in the Q&A panel.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that, Andrew, making sure that's clear. And again, the blue box, that's kind of where we were with V. There was no support for container networking security or cloud, really. Anything that's VMware Cloud on AWS solution is all based on NSXT. So if you're going to be doing VMC and AWS, that's going to be NSXT. We want to make sure we have that consistent, look and feel across. So what's new with NSXT 3X? Federation is a great new feature. Federation allows us to have multiple sites, and then we can have local managers at each site, which is pretty common. We want to have some kind of local control. And then if I want to be able to extend networks and have consistent security between sites, I can now implement federation. And I basically deploy global managers on one site that are primary, standby global managers at the other site, and then I can federate these kind of two separate environments and have a single pane of glass to manage those. And that could also be in the cloud. So once that capability is built into the cloud product and into VCF, that's going to really extend that. Security, without a doubt, the security is one of the best features that you get with NSX. You have the firewall that we know and love for controlling traffic east-west. And in today's climate where there's all these attacks going on, you've heard about all the different breaches, the recent government breach that just happened, anything that you can do to prevent the lateral spread of malware. And now with the IDS IPS feature, Once we lock that down, looking at it even closer, what are those traffic flows? We do have the ability to have some app ID capabilities, that are predefined. You can also now define your own and learn your own. There's the firewall on the edge also, which gives you another layer if you choose to implement that, right? And then again, some agents for Windows 2016 and some Red Hat platforms. And now extending into the container world, into Kubernetes, and being able to have support for containers, either in the cloud or on-prem, right? The ability to leverage API integration for building load balancers and Kubernetes type constructs in your environment. And then you have that concept of the converged network interface, where we have the ability to implement security on the container network interface. So if you have a container, we can now implement security just like on a VNIC, a VM. We can do that at the container level. And then a really important new feature, especially where we're talking about NSX-V to T migrations, that bullet on the last one there about the converged VDS, or they're now calling it the CVDS, where you have the ability to upgrade your environment to vSphere 7, and you can take advantage of NSXT 3.0 and vSphere 7. And instead of building a separate NSXT and VDS, we can now have the CVDS, where they're kind of both together as one, right? So some really great features, with 3.x. So where to begin? Where do we begin? So I have NSXV. It's a great product. NSXT is the new kid in town. We're going to get that ability to do things across cloud. How do we do it? So what do we need to migrate? So you have your virtual workloads. You have your VMs, right? They're plugged into NSXV networks, or they're protected by NSXV security. We need to migrate those to T. Your gateway, that's currently, if you're doing the network virtualization, your gateway is going to be in a DLR or a UDLR. We're going to have to swing that gateway over to a T1 or a T0. And then there'll be like the network services. The network services would be like your firewall, load balancer, NAT rules, VPN, those type of services. We need to take those from V, and we got to move them over to T. And of course, on the gateways, there'll be the whole concept of the federated networks as well. So what are the different strategies? So in-place migration with migration coordinator. So VMware's NSXT manager, management cluster when you deploy it. What you can actually do is have a V environment, deploy the NSXT managers, go to the command line of that appliance, the primary manager, and you can start the migration coordinator service. And when you start the migration coordinator service, you're going to flip into the UI, and in the user interface, there is a wizard that's going to go through, and it's going to allow you to point to an NSXV manager, pull that data in, and look at it and determine whether or not you're going to be able to, support the migration. So you deploy your NSXT managers, you would deploy some edge nodes. Now there's a specific process for that, where you would actually download the OVA, so there's no configuration, and then kind of bring in the networking, tweak your edges a little bit, bring in your security, look to see if the firewall rules are compatible, and DJ can talk about that more in a little bit. And then you actually do an in-place upgrade, where the environment is sitting there, and I'm going to basically kind of run through it and do the managers, do the edges, bring the security in, and then the hosts, and just kind of roll through that migration process. So we got a question in the Q&A. So NSX Intelligence is part of NSXT license SKU, or it needs to be purchased separately. What are the supported features that are supported? Well, with NSX Intelligence, depending on the license level, I believe you have to be enterprise licensed. I have to double check that. Andrew, maybe you can check that.
Yeah, I'll check it in the background, but I think it needs to be at least enterprise or enterprise plus. I can't remember which one, but yeah, it's not that it's a different SKU than NSXT separately. It's just you get it at a certain level of licensing.
Right, and keep the questions coming. And then the VRNI is also included depending on your license level. So in-place migration coordinator is a pretty good tool. It does have a few limits to it. It supports 5 basic topologies, which Andrew's going to talk about in a little bit here. The coexist method is actually pretty cool. Coexist, lift and shift, is where we have a vCenter and we have an NSXV manager, and we're going to either purchase new hardware, or we're going to take the existing cluster and we're going to pull a host out, assuming you have available resources. We're going to take a host out of that cluster. We're going to build a new cluster, drop the host into the new cluster, which is going to remove the NSXV bits because you can't have NSXT bits and NSXV bits at the same time. And the NSXV deployment is done at the cluster level. So we need to build that new cluster with the same vCenter, bring it over, remove it. Now, when you do that lift and shift, in order to migrate the workloads from the vPrep host to the tPrep host, we have to think about things like whether we're going to bridge or not, right? If you're not doing network virtualization, you may not need a bridge. It depends on the use case, but there is a method to bridge from the NSXV VXLAN to the NSXT overlay, migrate the workloads over, and then flip the gateway. And then we also have to consider the firewall rules. The last one would be coexist with HCX. Very similar to the previous one. It's just that it may be a different stack. Let's say you purchased a VCF solution, or you're moving to the cloud or something like that. And what you want to do is have this separate environment that's standing at the same time. And what you're going to do is deploy HCX. And HCX is going to extend the network between the two and allow you to migrate the VMs either bulk, cold, or depending on the license of HCX, you can actually do the vSphere assisted replication across, and allows you to move a little bit more seamlessly. But at the same time, we need to be able to migrate the firewall rules over. So if you're doing a coexist, you're probably going to build the networking probably independently, but you're going to be migrating the firewall rules over and thinking about how that's going to be implemented, right? Oh, go back just one second, Andrew. The other thing there to note is the fact that the migration coordinator doesn't understand universal objects as part of the migration. That would be a limit of the migration coordinator, and it doesn't understand OSPF.
All right, so we've got some questions popping in here. I think it's good to just talk a little bit about some of the customers that we work with, some of the just implementations that we've done of this migration process. So is coexist valid if you migrate from Cisco to NSXT?
Are you talking Cisco ACI, I think, probably? Is the question there? Yes. Yeah, so I mean, there is no particular feature other than doing a script to bring, I would assume, the application-centric type security from Cisco ACI over. So, you know, we're really talking about going from NSXV to NSXT here. Are you talking about going from Cisco ACI to NSXT? Is that the question?
Because if it is from anything that's going on in your hardware, that would just entail the move of the gateway for those VMs down into the NSX world, right? I mean, that's just more of a traditional move to the NSX platform.
And from a REST NSX perspective, just chiming in here, is that there's two things that we could possibly offer on this side. One is, from a Cisco perspective, if in that ACI fabric, there's also Cisco ASA firewalls. We support native conversion over from Cisco ASA, Palo Alto, Fortinet over to NSX. V or T doesn't matter. So if that ASAs or whatever is part of that ACI architecture, the answer is yes, we can do that. The other part of it is that we are building in features into our application that we'll show you in a few minutes that will allow us to synchronize between ACI and NSX policies and tags. And we'll talk about that further.
Yeah, thanks, DJ. I mean, hopefully that gives you a good idea. But that's more of just a platform shift to NSX rather than a V to T migration. So if you have more questions on this, feel free to just get in touch with Brent, and we'll have our contact information here towards the end. And we can always have a more in-depth discussion of what your physical Cisco environment is like and what it would take to move to NSXT.
And the other question up there is about if the current implementation is cross vCenter NSXV. So at a very high level, if you just go back to the previous slide, Andrew, here's a really easy way to break it down. Yeah. If you think about these options, if you're doing a cross vCenter NSXV, you're not going to be doing the Inplace migration coordinator, right? Because The cross vCenter NSXV most likely is going to be looking at universal objects, most likely. And the migration coordinator doesn't support that. So the way you would migrate from a cross vCenter NSXV would be to most likely go ahead and deploy NSXT with federation, right? And then what we could do then at that point is migrate the firewall rules over into NSXT using the REST NSX migration assistance tool.
And so what category would that fall under then?
It's still a coexist lift and shift in the middle because we're still using the same vCenter. You know, we're not building a brand new stack. You know, it's not a separate, you know, it's not like I went out and bought a whole new VCF stack or a brand new, you know, 3-tier hardware architecture and build it. It's the same vCenter. I'm deploying the NSX managers. I'm building the local managers on both sides, similar to what we have with NSXV, deploying the global managers, building up my federation networks, and then migrating workloads over. And then there's some bridging that goes on there again. So we talk about the bridging again, you know, to build that, and then bringing the firewall rules over. So the short answer is it would be a coexist lift and shift. It could be a coexist with a brand new environment with an HCX migration, but not necessarily. And you could also use HCX even though it's the same vCenter, depending on what some of the limitations may be, just to help the migration go a little bit smoother. So that's a possibility, but it's most likely that HCX is when you have two separate stacks, one completely brand new versus what you have now.
Yep. And just to be clear, you can have NSXV and NSXT exist within the same vCenter. Just make sure that it's on separate hosts, right? You can't have one host with both V and T on it. It's got to be separate hosts. So It's all happening within the same environment, but we're freeing up some V hosts and uninstalling V and then installing T on the new hosts that have.
Yeah, the thing there, Andrew, is interesting is you're deploying NSX managers, right? So just to get started, you know, the NSX managers can be on V hosts, right? So the NSX managers, the NSXT managers you deploy can be on V hosts that are prepped. That's okay. The only thing you have to be considerate of when you deploy the NSXT managers on V hosts is if there are firewall rules where you have to create an exclusion. So if the NSXV host is prepped, you put an NSXT manager on that host. And if there's like a zero trust where the firewall bottom rule is any deny, then you just got to make sure on your V NSX manager, you put the exclusions in to get the managers deployed and the edges as you kind of start out.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect segue into Matt's question, which is how do you handle an in-place migration without purchasing any additional hardware? Is that possible? And what considerations do you have to think of when you're going to use, let's say, just maybe one cluster to do all of this?
Yeah, so what's going to happen is you're going to deploy your NSXT managers. You're going to start up that migration coordinator service. You're going to download OVAs of edges. So they have no configuration in them at all. In other words, you're not actually deploying the edges from the NSXT manager. You're actually going to deploy them separate. So there's nothing in them. They're completely clean slate. And then when you start the migration coordinator, it's going to allow you then to pull the data in, right? And it's going to bring the networking in, the security. If there's any conflicts, there's like a wizard that it goes through and it'll have like little warnings on it. And you can go back and depending on the environment, you may have to change some things or update some things in order for the migration to go forward. So you might have to quote unquote kind of normalize the environment a little bit, but it'll kind of walk you through that. The information from the NSXV ESGs will get converted into the NSXT edge nodes. You'll be given an opportunity at that point to fix that or kind of clean it up and massage it a little bit, if you will, and make sure that it's in place, right? And then the next step is to make sure that you have everything you need to finish off bringing in your firewall rules. Again, depending on the environment, there could be a little bit of cleanup you may have to do in order to proceed, and it's going to tell you about that. And then the next thing you're going to do is start going through your hosts, right? So it's going to put a host in maintenance mode. It's going to remove the V bits. It's going to place the T bits on, and then it's going to, you know, allow you to ship the workloads back over and then go to the next host and so on and so forth until you get yourself all the way wrapped through to the end, to the point where you remove the V components. Yeah, and the coexist is the same thing. The difference with the coexist would be, it's just that you're going to build a new cluster. You're not buying any new hardware. You just need to make sure that if you're going to put a host in maintenance mode and take it out of the cluster and move it to a new cluster, that you have enough resources to do that. So you can do a coexist without purchasing new hardware, as long as you have enough resources to squeeze your environment down by taking a host out. The only caveat to that would be if it's a vSAN cluster and it's real small, that can be a little bit more challenging because it's some of the vSAN requirements for how many hosts you have. But assuming you've got enough resources, you can do it, not purchase any new hardware, build a new cluster, put the host in maintenance mode, bring it out, you'll get prepped, with NSXT. Again, the underlying network cards are very important in understanding the availability of those network cards to support the NSXT NVDS or the CNVDS and how that's going to work. And then you can kind of shift, import your firewall rules and kind of, shift things over.
Yeah. So thanks for answering all those questions, Bill. And yeah, I mean, this is why we created the migration task force, right? There's a lot of questions that may need to be answered. It's all going to be specific to your particular environment. And if you don't match one of the pre-supported topologies for an in-place migration with the migration coordinator, you may be left scratching your head a little bit as to what to do. So, we're doing a good number of these migrations right now as we speak. Our 27 virtual team is probably doing 8 to 10 of them right now, getting that experience under our belt. We've done a number of them already, and we can kind of really guide you guys and help answer these questions as you go along. So you do have these options as to what you're going to do. And one of them is the migration coordinator, but it's important to note that you have to meet all the prereqs to utilize that migration coordinator. And that includes, being on the correct NSX version, making sure you support one of the topologies, all of your vSphere has to be correct. You have to be really ready, essentially, to convert everything that you have in V to T all at once through this process. So let's just talk about using that real quick here in the couple of topologies, and then I'll toss it back to Bill and we can finish up our piece and get it over to DJ to show you another option as to how to do these migrations. And the first topology that you're going to see here is, and really all the topologies are going to be fairly simplistic that are supported by the migration coordinator. So this is the option where you can use the tool provided inside of the NSXT manager to convert everything that you have in V over to T all at once. And just a quick lesson in what we're going to see. We all know our NSXV distributed router and our edges, and then we have our virtualized networks here that our VMs are going to be plugged into. And what that's going to do is it's going to convert over, if you have this topology and it matches exactly, it'll convert over to these NSXT constructs that we see over here. This virtual router that we have right here is called the tier 0 router. In NSXT, the tier 0 router is the interaction point between the physical and the virtual world. Very, very similar to how the edge services gateway in V is associated with the physical world, and we have that BGP adjacency here. So if you have BGP, oh, sorry about that. If you have BGP, you can do this conversion over to T. You get a tier 0. You get a distributed routing functionality of that tier 0, very similar to your DLR. And then you get an instance of that tier 0 as a service router inside of your edges, and you can maintain that north-south connectivity. So that's one option. If you're in this topology here, where you have a distributed router and you're using ECMP edges, so in the previous one, we were in active passive, but if you're using ECMP to your edges and then ECMP to the north-south with BGP, it'll convert to a very similar topology in NSXT, where you get your tier 0, you get your tier 0 distributed router, you get your service router instances, but now they're in active modes that we can ECMP to either one of our two edges, and then we can do the same thing north-south if we choose. Another supported topology is if we have multi-level or provider/tenant edges in our NSXV environment, where we have a set of edges that are going to be interfacing with the physical network, and then maybe tenant edges or edges that are going to provide stateful services in HA mode down here. And then we have our distributed logical router. And what that will turn into in NSXT is the addition of a tier 1 gateway, which can have a service router that lives inside of edge nodes in its instance of the distributed router. And then a level above that to interface with the physical network. Once again, we have our tier 0 gateway and the service routers that live in the edge nodes that have the BGP adjacency to the physical. So if you have that kind of ECMP north-south and then stateful services like load balancing a level below, it'll convert to what you see on the right-hand side with a multi-tier approach with the tier 1 and the tier 0. And then the fourth topology is and the main difference that we're going to see here is all the routing is the same, except for that we have a load balancer here. If you're in a topology where you're doing this one-arm load balancer setup, that will also convert over to NSXT directly, and we can utilize the load balancing here in combination with our tier 1 and tier 0. So we'll have our tier 1 distributed routing capability, the tier 1 load balancing SR in the edge, and then the tier 0 for the north-south traffic. And then to get through this, just so we can continue our conversation and get to more questions, we have topology number 5, which is where we have our edge services gateways, no distributed routing, direct connectivity to a VLAN or our VXLAN logical switches, and then load balancing directly through those HA edges. You can also have that, and it converts over to our tier 0 with the direct connection to the VLANs or the overlay networks in NSXT. So the bigger question becomes, well, what's going on if we don't meet one of those topologies? What if we have universal? What goes on with our distributed firewall rules? What's happening there? And that's kind of the question that we're answering through those coexist, those lift and shifts, those custom stand-ups on new hardware. That's the space that's going to live. But there have been some updates. So in NSXT 3.1, the migration coordinator does have some additional capabilities like enabling lift and shift for the distributed firewall, for VRA topologies, addition of the capabilities that are supported in NSXT for guest introspection services, and for multiple VTEP topologies. Also, it has been scaled up to 256 hosts, so we should update that previous slide, but that was the 3.0, but this is the 3.1. So 256 hosts, 32 vSphere clusters, and up to 50,000 distributed firewall rules per NSX manager. So it's been beefed up a little bit. The capabilities are there, but you still have to live within those supported topologies. So let's get to some questions. So I see Juan says, are there any limitations when it comes to the amount of items that can be migrated? For example, we have one environment with over 5,000 logical switches. I don't think so, as far as long as you meet that topology within the migration coordinator. But if you do a lift and shift, then we'll just have the process of those 5,000 being recreated. And when you're at a large scale like that, that's where the tool that DJ has created and REST NSX is really going to help you out with the MAT tool. But yeah, there shouldn't be.
There's a maximum guide. If you go to the VMware Documentation Center, if you just do a Google search for migration coordinator limits, it'll pull up the maximum guide and it'll list all the maximums that you can do with the migration coordinator.
Yeah.
Which I posted in the chat there.
So in the coexist approach with those scenarios, does migration change anything on the vSphere networking, assuming it takes care of the north-south needs on vSphere? Sergey, I am not 100% sure what you're asking there, but as far as we're concerned, we're not touching anything with the vSphere networking or port groups. So as long as those port groups that you were using for the north-south communication before are still existing in the VDS that you're using for the north-south traffic in NSXT, then there shouldn't be anything that you need to do from a physical perspective or a vSphere distributed switch or port group perspective either. That should all be untouched.
Just understand though, the coexist is not migration coordinator, right?
Right.
So coexist means I've deployed NSXT manager in parallel with V, and I'm going to either manually use the script, use rest NSX mat, and kind of shift things over.
Yeah, and then the 5 scenario piece that we just looked at, that's more of like an overwrite where it takes your V stuff, gets rid of it, and then creates the T components where the V used to be. Yeah. So one is we have both of them running at the same time and we're moving things over to T. That's the coexist. And then the migration coordinator and the 5 scenarios, that's going to be an overwrite. So again, you know, as we wrap up here, and we'll answer a few more questions before we get into the REST NSX demo, but what you can be left a little bit here is trying to answer all the questions of where you fit in. You could say, is our versioning correct? Do we have a supported topology? Are we multi-site? Do we have universal objects? Do we have, you know, X number of objects in our environment that can be moved? Or what are the objects that we're even using? Are we doing that we can actually convert for our NSX-V to get to T environment? And so that's literally, this is the reason that we created the NSX-V to NSX-T migration task force at 27 Virtual. If you're left scratching your head here,
Hey, Andrew, sounds like we lost your audio there. So
yeah, I got an internet unstable for a second. I apologize, everybody. But what I wanted to say is that this is the reason that we created the migration task force, is to help you guys answer these questions and to carve out a path to help you and possibly you know, do the work to assist you in migrating from NSX-V to NSX-T. So you know, an hour or 40 minutes or so doesn't really give justice to the amount of thought that goes into making all these decisions. And if you'd like to have a deeper conversation, please feel free to get in touch with us. But that being said, I do want to turn it over to DJ from REST NSX so that he can give his take on V to T migrations. And we're really happy to be partnered with REST NSX. And I think you guys will really enjoy their approach to this process. So let me get control over this Zoom session once again in this slide deck, and I will toss it over to him. My internet dropping off there for a second made me lose control of my screen share.
Yeah. Well, so while you're doing that, Andrew, everyone, DJ Antonucci with REST NSX, one of the co-founders of the company. I was at VMware with the other co-founder, Johnny Bailey. We were in the NSX business unit on the sales side of things, sales and engineering. And this goes back about 3 years ago. And we saw a need in the marketplace for really 2 product lines or 2 solutions for our customers and partners. One was around just general NSX management. So we made a tool, a virtual appliance that allows the day-to-day operations and deployment of NSX really, really easy. And then the second tool, it's called the MAT tool, is NSX-V to T migrations. So where we fall in that bucket or that paradigm of strategies is the lift and shift, the coexist. So for example, to highlight the 3 options, or you have migration coordinator. If it fits, use that. Obviously it's free. And if you can use it, great. The other bucket is the, do it yourself, script it, manually build it. Doesn't work for a lot of environments, especially 5,000 logical switches. And then the third bucket is that coexist, lift and shift. And that's the bucket we fall into. So we've created a product that creates an automation approach to a migration on that front. So the first thing I'm going to cover, because we're kind of speed dating here, right? Because I really only have 10 minutes to do a V to T migration here. So I'm going to talk about some highlights here. The first one is that it's a non-disruptive approach, right? Because remember, lift and shift is we're building T in parallel with V. We move over our hosts at our own pace. So that's very important. The other thing is that we support consolidation. So T scales a lot higher than V does in many respects, and people want to consolidate their NSX managers. So we can consolidate multiple Vs down to a single T. The most important thing, in my opinion, is the bullet says auto detects and transforms incompatible objects. That's what we call an intent-based approach. So for example, if you have universal objects, that's an incompatible objects with T. It doesn't know what those are. So any other tool is going to flag it and say, you need to go change your V environment. Another example would be a firewall rule with a vCenter object in it, like say a cluster or a VM. NSXT does not know what that is. So migration coordinator or otherwise would tell you, you need to go convert your existing NSXV firewall rules over to something that's supported. We take the intent-based approach and say, we know what you mean to do, so we're going to take care of it for you. So with that, Andrew, if you stop sharing, I will share my screen and we'll jump right into quick demos. Thank you.
Yep, you got it. And I know that a lot of you still have questions. If you want to stick around after the 2 o'clock end time, don't worry, we'll open it up and you guys can unmute your mics and we can have a conversation. I know there are still a lot of questions out there and we don't have time to answer. I'm going to go through and write some of the answers to the Q&A section right now. But feel free to stick around. I'll be here at the very least, and I'll try to answer as many questions as I can before we wrap it up. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you. So I just logged into REST NSX. So this is the first product we'll talk about, which is the manager for your existing environment. And the reason I logged in here is to show you really 3 basic components. One is that we can flatten the operational learning curve, if you will, of migrating to T. Because if you know how to manage your V environment using REST NSX, you know how to manage your T environment. So for example, I'm logged into REST NSX and I have all my data sources added here, V managers, T managers, whatever it is. And this is my look and feel for NSXV, right? If I want to manage, do a deployment, whatever it is. This is the look and feel, security groups, tags, IP sets, whatever. I switch over to NSXT. This is a 3.0 instance. My user experience is going to be updated based upon the nomenclature of NSXT. So for example, NS groups were security groups, et cetera. But I'm looking at the same thing. If I know how to create a firewall rule using REST NSX and V, I effectively know how to do it in NSXT because my learning experience is exactly the same. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is that there's a lot of tools built into REST NSX to help this migration go smoother. For example, we have a tool called Object Analyzer. What Object Analyzer will do is we'll look at your existing V environment and tell you what's stale or what's inactive. So we're going to look at your firewall rules. We're going to look at your security groups. We're going to look at a lot of different things in this environment. Actually, let me switch back to my V manager because obviously this is a brand new T environment. It doesn't have a whole lot of data. And we're going to review what we found. So for example, we're going to look at your firewall rules and say that, okay, I have 3,000 firewall rules and 80% of them have no hits on them. Why am I going to move those to NSXT? I can clean them up. So in this environment, anything in orange is marked as inactive. But it's just not what rule is enabled, disabled. We actually look at parent-child relationships. So for example, I look at my IP sets. I see that I have 30 inactive IP sets. Why is it inactive? Just because it's an object doesn't mean it's an actual in use. So is it used in a firewall rule? If so, that still doesn't mean it's active because maybe that firewall rule has no hits or it's disabled. So not only do we mark the firewall rule as disabled, but we'll also mark that child element as stale as well. So looking at this, it says, I don't necessarily need to move all this over to NSXT because it's not in use. We'll also look for duplicate objects and we'll show you the percentage of duplication. Like this IP set is a 90% overlap with this other IP set, however it may be. So very, very powerful tool from that perspective. The other one is Rule Analyzer, which in my opinion could be even more powerful. So we can look at all your firewall sections, tell you the anatomy of them, but most importantly, we can do an analysis and say, let me look at these 1,000 firewall rules. Show me the duplicates, but also give me a lot more data here. Meaning, if I look at all my rules here, I can say, show me all rules that haven't been hit in the last 180 days or never. Highlight them on the screen here. Show me all my rules that have logging enabled or disabled. I can very quickly and easily see this information. So I can make informed decisions before I start going down this path. And the last one I want to highlight is some reporting capabilities where we can provide automatic documentation via one button click of your environment. I can document my V environment. I can document my T environment, push it out to a Word document, whatever it is. It's a full run book of my environment out there. So with that, a REST NSX demo, just so you know, is about an hour, hour and a half all by itself because there's so many features like integration into Verni, role-based access control, a lot of great features. So please reach out to us if you want to do a deeper dive on REST NSX side. As it relates to a V to T demo, I'm going to switch over to my other screen here. So you should be staring at my NSXV manager in this environment. And we'll run through the environment really, really quick. We have our source environment. We have our destination environment, which is T 3.0. And we'll log in here just to show you what's required from a baseline perspective. Then in the middle, we have the MAT tool, Migration Assistance Tool, which is, again, an OVA like rest of the sites. So looking at the source environment, I'm going to showcase two things for the sake of time. One is from a firewall rule perspective. You'll see we have universal objects. We have service composer objects. We also have a group here called testing objects that has all those unsupported things in NSXT. For example, data center, cluster, distributed port group, VNIC, VM. Any of these things, universal or any of these objects, if you have them in your firewall rules, migration coordinator or any other tool is going to flag them and say, it's not supported at NSXT. We take an intent-based approach and say, look, we know the members of the data center. We know the members of the cluster. We know what VM is attached to this VNIC. So we will create a comparable object in NSXT, and we'll show you that here live in the demo. The other thing I'm going to show you is from an edge perspective. In this environment, we have every topology represented. Standalone ESG, HA, multi-tier, NAT, load balancing, whatever it is, it's turned on. And we're going to focus on this one edge called single services, because he had his load balancing, NAT, now a bunch of virtual servers, everything configured on this guy. He even has OSPF configured. So one of the questions earlier was, how do we handle OSPF? Again, we take that intent-based approach. Any other tool would say, you need to go convert your OSPF to BGP. We actually, during the migration, will convert your OSPF neighbors over to BGP neighbor statements. So to make your life as easy as possible. From a T perspective, I actually have some existing firewall rules here. And these are ones that are just on the system. Because remember, I can do a multiple V manager to a single T manager migration, so consolidation. So this represents existing firewall rules in my NSXT manager, which do not, that are different than the one that were in my V environment on here. But from a deployment perspective, I only require three things to use the MAT tool. One is I have NSX manager deployed, could be a global manager, local manager. I'll show you, I'll talk about those details. Number two is we need, from a fabric perspective, we need an edge node and an edge cluster. And we need that for placement of the SR components of the tier ones. So if I'm doing load balancing, NAT, whatever it is, I need at least one edge node. We have two on our environment for scale testing. I also need an edge cluster. We have two also for capacity here. But really, those are the three things: NSX manager, an edge node, and an edge cluster deployed here. So once we have those set up, we go into the MAT tool. We log in. And just like REST NSX, it's an OVA. And I would add my data sources. Here's an example where I have three V managers all being converted over to a single T manager. 232 through 231 is the one I was just logged into. We also have .36 and .49 in this environment. Only two of the three are licensed, but we're going to leverage this guy. So if I click on this, this is the first step of the four-step migration. Data sources, collect the data, look at our recommendation, and actually do the migration on here. So I would add my V manager, my vCenter, my T manager. And when I do this, I can run it in assessment mode. And this is a service that 27 Virtual offers. They can come into your environment, load up the MAT tool, run it in assessment mode. It'll generate a PDF of all those issues that will be an issue if you don't use our approach on here. So if you use any other approach. So obviously we're going to do a migration mode here. Go into the migration options where I get to select, do I want to use the policy framework, the legacy framework, the legacy API. I think there was a question in the chat window about that. So you can select that. We can also mark objects. So I have multiple V managers going to a single T manager. To avoid name conflicts, I can append characters or tag in scope. It says everything coming from this NSX manager, tag it with NSX1. And so we'll keep it that. But we also give you the option to dictate what this migration looks like. So we don't say it's going to be migration method A, B, C, or D, meaning these are the options. You can actually select how we want to handle the transformations of those unsupported objects. When I'm ready to go, the second step is I'm going to load configuration data from the NSXV environment. So we're reaching out to vCenter, we're reaching out to NSX and grabbing all this data. And at the end of this screen, you're going to see two buttons pop up in the top right corner. One is an export JSON button, and the other one is a PDF assessment. The JSON export you could take that JSON export and bring it into your lab and do a V to T migration without having access to the original vCenter or NSX Manager. So very, very powerful tool. The other one is that assessment document, which I'll share a copy in a minute. But in this object status window, you're going to see greens, oranges, and reds. This is intentional because this is telling you everything that you should be aware of if you should do this migration yourself or through another tool. So the goal here is to show you those issues, but the next screen is going to show you how we will resolve them for you. So in this environment, as we collect this data, we can watch the log. We can also see kind of the inventory being populated real time. So we're collecting our firewall rules, et cetera. As that wraps up, I'm going to actually switch over to my other tab, which is a copy of the assessment document. So this is part of that service that 27 Virtual offers. They come in, load the MAT tool, get and produce this assessment document. So the first thing you'll notice, it's a summary of counts of things in your environment. So for example, how many security groups have regular expressions? T doesn't support that. So we're going to flag it, something we need to transform. Or security groups with 5 levels of nesting. T doesn't support that. So there's a lot of things that we call out here that T doesn't support that you should be aware of. But we also give you the full inventory of the environment and tell you the status of it. So going back to the MAT tool, we finished the collection. And so I want to show you 2 things, distributed firewall rules. We'll look at those security groups that we're looking at before. You notice, I'm sorry, not testing security groups, testing objects. You're going to notice that we mark those rules as info because T doesn't support a data center, doesn't support a cluster, doesn't support a DV group, et cetera, et cetera. So we mark it as info to let you know there isn't a direct NSXT object, but we're going to make it compatible. So I can validate everything before I want to migrate. I can also be selective, say, I don't want to migrate this firewall rule, right? Whatever I want to do. The other thing from a network virtualization perspective is I can preview what my environment looked like. So single services, how is it connected in my V environment? Here's the ESG is connected to this uplink, down to this logical switch, and down to this DLR. Remember this diagram, because this is exactly what we're going to propose for the NSXT architecture, but using the T nomenclature, if you will. So at this point, I can proceed, get that JSON file, the assessment document, but the third step is review transformations. This is all the recommendations. We're turning all those oranges and reds either to greens and oranges on here. And just like before, I can look at the recommendations before I actually start this. So the recommendations are, for example, marked with orange in info. So if we look at testing objects, we'll see all those rules. What are we going to do? Based upon the option we selected at the beginning, we say create an NS group with the V and put the VMs in it for the unsupported objects. And we'll do that live here in a minute. From an ESG perspective, we can pick where we want to place the edge node, or I'm sorry, the services component, the tier 1 services component on here. And we can also validate the architecture. Okay, this looks just like the V architecture, but instead we're using a VRF, an active-active edge, tier 1 connected to a segment instead of a logical switch. So it's the same architecture. Now, if I'm ready, I click begin migration. So we're going out to NSXT via API, creating all those objects, all that architecture. And as soon as we get through the DFW phase, we'll go back into the NSX Manager to show you all those objects that were created in there. So with that said, like I said, this is kind of speed dating. A lot of architecture and innovation goes into the product, but love to answer a few questions while this migration wraps up. And Andrew, I apologize. I'm not looking at the chat window, so if there are questions.
No worries. First one, how is REST NSX licensed?
Got it. So REST NSX is licensed in 2 flavors. So REST NSX, the product I started out with, which is the operations and everything, is what we call our enterprise license set. And that's licensed per physical CPU. So if I have 100 licenses of NSX, I would have 100 licenses of REST NSX. Then you have an optional component called Enterprise Plus, and that adds on the MAT capability. So for an additional $50 per CPU, you can get entitlement to the V to T migration tool on the front. So that's how REST NSX is licensed.
That's it so far, but what I want to do is just share my screen for the ending and how people can get in touch with us. And then what I'll do is pop it back over to you and we'll open up mics for questions.
Real quick, Andrew, before you do that, let me go over to NSXT Looks like DFW is almost done here. So let's go into distributed firewall and just prove out it's not smoke and mirrors. Here's all our new sections. And it was appended with NSX1 because that's what we told it to do. And if we look at testing objects, we had created raw IP in the firewall rule like we should have, but we also created NS groups with the effective members of that cluster. So we called it the same name and put the VMs in there that was part of that cluster in the NSXV world. But every object, everything was brought over. No errors, no issues saying go correct something in NSXV. We handle it for you through our transformations and work with the engineering expertise at 27 Virtual to make sure this goes as smoothly as possible.
Yeah, the other thing too, DJ, touch on real quick before you finish up, Andrew, is the post-migration task for the tagging.
Yep, so I can't click the button yet, but in less than 2 minutes, there's gonna be a new button here that shows up called post-migration tasks. What this is, it represents everything we could not do during the migration because the VM inventory doesn't exist in the T manager yet. So for us to be able to attach a tag to a VM or attach a VM to a security group, it has to exist in the inventory. It just happened to be that Photon VM2 already existed in inventory, so we added it to the NS group. What a post-migration task is once this wraps up, as I move VMs, as I move hosts over, the inventory will be populated on the T side. We will detect that and enable you to come into the application and assign the tags, assign the VMs to the NS groups, et cetera, et cetera.
Sounds good. So with that, I'm starting to unmute, or well, not unmute, but at least give you the ability to unmute yourself if you want. Bill or Brent, if you want to go down the list of the attendees and give them the allow to talk button, just click on allow to talk until that you see the mic come up in Zoom. But we'll go through and allow you guys to chat. What I want to do is just pop over to my screen one more time and say thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come hang with us and learn a little bit about NSX V to T migrations. Know that 27 Virtual does much more than V to Ts. We do have a dedicated task force for it, but any NSX related, even the entire virtual cloud network related questions or projects, we also have capabilities in Horizon, automation, so on and so forth, VMware focused, all those advanced capabilities. So please reach out to us if you have any questions, and we'd be happy to have a more detailed conversation with you, bring in the rest NSX team as well, get you a more detailed demo. We want to help you ease this process of the V to T migration. I know there's a lot that goes into it, so please do reach out to us. The easiest way to get in touch with us is to email brent.kaplan@27virtual.com, and he will take great care of you guys and get that meeting scheduled. And then the last piece is, don't forget, when you do close out of this, if you stick around for the Q&A, remember when you close your window, it's going to pop up with a browser window. Please fill out that survey, and the odds are not bad at all that you'll win a $100 Amazon gift card. So thanks again. Let's keep allowing some people to unmute their mics, and then we'll go into Q&A. And I can even toss it back over to you, DJ, so that...
Yep. It looks like we have one from Juan here about clusters are not compatible with T DFW rules. That is correct. What are those translated to? So that's part of the intent-based approach. So for example, if I'm using a cluster in a firewall rule, we will translate it to an NS group in NSXT. So as you may know, in a firewall rule in NSXT, or even the apply to, the only options are raw IP and an NS group. So everything has to be part of that. So a cluster will be transformed into an NS group, and all the members of that cluster, either via the VMs or IP, depending upon what you selected on the migration, will be added to that NS group. So it's an effective mirror of that cluster in NSXT.
Yep. So if you guys have a question, you should be able to unmute your mics now, and feel free to just ask some questions. We're here for you guys.
Will that NS group will be a dynamic group, and it get updated as the data center grows?
Good question. So it will. So there's not a dynamic criteria in an NS group for a cluster. So it is actually, they are added as static members. but we do have a feature in REST NSX that allows you to synchronize your V rules to your T rules during this migration. So let's say you have a slow migration and you're adding more members to that cluster. We implement something called a policy sync between V and T. So you can set a policy sync that says, if this section change in V and I'm adding more members to my cluster, right, more VMs, we'll calculate the effective members and push that to NSXT in the NS group. So very, very good question. And so I think clusters is one of those that we don't see too often in a firewall rule, but more so maybe on the apply to versus a source or destination. But hopefully that answers your question.
Awesome. I just put Brent's contact information. I put his email in the chat so you guys can copy and paste that for getting in touch with us. Any other questions? I see a lot of people still sticking around, so there's got to be some questions out there.
Hello, this is Greg Hurd. I had asked a question earlier about migrating from T to T scenario. We have a pivotal reference architecture DCF environment set up that was built on the advanced UI. And so when that's deprecated here in newer versions of T, once that finally goes away, do you guys have a way to migrate from the advanced to the simplified UI without having to rebuild all the components?
From a REST NSX perspective, there's probably a 27 virtual answer as well, but from a REST NSX perspective, we do not support T to T migration from legacy to policy. We do support migration from V to like VMC on AWS or T to VMC on AWS as an example, but we never built that out into the tool. We started to, but we didn't see a great demand for it. So if that's a huge pain point for you, we can definitely talk about that further. And
yeah, Greg, that's a great question and kind of a tough spot that you're in. But yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we'd kind of have to work together on to figure out a really solid solution. But yeah, thanks for bringing it up.
Okay.
Questions? Anyone else?
I guess this is DJ. I'll make just kind of a general comment around the assessment mode that we're talking about earlier. And I think it's very valuable, regarding the assessment mode and getting that into your environment, because it really highlights things that you may have not even thought about, right? You obviously know if you have universal objects or things like that, but you may not realize, a certain apply to or a membership in a security group is a static member that T doesn't support, like a cluster we're talking about. So really the assessment mode, takes, 10, 15 minutes, install the OVA, run it. And 27 Virtual and ourselves can help you out through that process. But it's really a nice foray into really seeing what the environment looks like without spending hours of documenting things.
Any other thoughts? I'm sure if you're wondering it, others are probably wondering the same. We still got a good amount of people here, so feel free to fire away.
Andrew, yeah, I'm wondering, what's for lunch?
You don't get a lunch break, DJ. You got to do 10 more demos today.
I think if there are questions, you obviously shout them out, but I'll just kind of throw out some data points of some migrations that we've done in tandem with 27 Virtual and also by like VMware directly, is that we're finding that the migration time isn't around the configuration. Like you could have thousands of firewalls you want to move over. The migration time is about planning, obviously, but number two is just validating what we're proposing as an architecture. So I think that's just a kind of a paradigm shift of, a typical migration, the focus time and energy wise is typically the effort itself, the manual effort. Whereas when we leverage this lift and shift strategy using automated methods, we can focus more on architecture engineering and, validating versus that legwork that's in the middle. So I think we've seen a huge, upshift in migration counts because of this different strategy.
Yeah, I don't think there's any denying, when you can take the stress off of how are we going to get this monumental task done and then automate it? It definitely gives you the ability to consider more, what are we actually going to, and how are we going to validate that architecture? So yeah, we've definitely found that to be the case as well. And, once you have that nailed down, then the process of actually moving things isn't so bad. So, I would say, Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about the hyperconverged and vSAN clusters and trying to do a lift and shift all in there and some of the experience that we've had with that?
I mean, every customer's environment can be a little bit different. So I think the great thing about the REST NSX tool, since that's kind of where we're ending on here, is just the fact that it really is going to simplify the process and take a lot of the pain out. Each customer is going to be a little bit different. You could say that maybe if your environment's diverse enough, maybe in one part of your environment, you're just doing a manual migration. Maybe you rip and replace and reinstall some components and bring some things over. Maybe I've got what we're seeing a lot is customers may have like an environment where they have like a dev environment that's real small and it's a vSAN cluster. Maybe they're a migration coordinator, in-place upgrade type customer. But that same customer, even though part of it's manual and part of it's in place, they're going to most likely have a primary production environment that has a large number of hosts or a large number of firewall rules or some complex configuration where the REST NSX tool is a perfect fit, right? So you go in there and you're going to want to leverage the best tool that best fits, your environment. But, I think, price of admission, even just forget the migration tool. I want to generate that run book with all the reports of all my configurations. That right there is worth the price of admission with REST NSX. That's amazing, right? The ability to go out there and pull that out. So those are great features. The fact you can bring over rules. We're seeing a lot of customers with thousands of firewall rules, thousands of rules. We have one customer right now that has over 10,000, firewall rules. I can't imagine trying to do that any other way than with REST NSX, right? We have other customers that have literally hundreds of, different types of, NSXV segments and configurations. So anything you do to save time to validate. The other great thing about using the REST NSX migration coordinator, the REST NSX MAT tool, migration assistance tool, is just the fact that it eliminates human error. That's going to be a really big part of it. And to have something that does that for you versus trying to manually, make that change is huge. So those are kind of some of the things that we see, as a partner and using the different tools and making sure you find the right fit. But, without a doubt, the REST NSX, MAT tool is going to greatly simplify the process. It's going to speed it up. It's going to eliminate human error and get you onto T and go from there. And then the thing I'll wrap it up with is once you get migrated from V to T using REST NSX MAT, you got this other product, right, that stands by itself that does a lot of really amazing things. And if you go to our website, we have some other demos, just on REST itself, where you can see kind of what that does as well. So you can definitely take a look at that and kind of see what that does. So yeah, I mean, every customer's environment is a little bit different, and you just want to make sure you have the right tool for the job. And this is definitely it.
Cool. Thanks, Bill. DJ, again, not to bore everybody, just one more data point that we didn't get to really a chance to cover, that Bill talked a lot about the great features of NSXT, like IDS, IPS, et cetera. And when you're doing this migration from V to T, everything like that is turned off, right? It's just, we're migrating over like for like, right? DFW and edges, et cetera. What we're starting to do is bake into the application, enabling those next generation features. So for example, what's shipping today within the product, you can do things like go back into one of those post-migration tasks and enable IDS through a three-step wizard, which if I do that in NSXT natively, I have to create policies and profiles. And I don't know if anyone's ever done it out there, but you essentially have to recreate your firewall rule set in your IDS policies. We, again, try to automate that. So for example, we know what we just built in NSXT from a DFW perspective. You can selectively say, I want this section, this rule, that rule, enable IDS for them, and click one button that says, push this policy out. And so immediately you can start seeing IDS alerts and events in NSXT without having to go through another cumbersome process of enabling it in the UI. So with that, I will be quiet.
Awesome. Well, I see a few familiar names in the crowd. I see some new ones. Hopefully you enjoyed this conversation. And again, if you want to have further, reach out to brent.kaplan@27virtual.com. Really, really appreciate you guys being here. Fill out that survey, get that gift card, and check out our website if you want to see more of our content. But thank you all so much one more time, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks, DJ. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks.
Thank you.